The evening sun was setting behind the tall buildings of downtown as the Kim family walked toward the Golden Palace restaurant. It was their first time visiting this upscale establishment, and they had been looking forward to celebrating their daughter Emily's academic achievement all week. David Kim had made sure to book a reservation 3 weeks in advance, knowing how popular the place was on Friday nights. The restaurant stood proudly on the corner, its golden letters gleaming against the dark brick walls. Through the large windows, they could see well-dressed people enjoying their meals in the warm lighting. Emily, wearing her favorite blue dress, couldn't hide her excitement. Her younger brother Tommy kept jumping around, his new shoes squeaking on the sidewalk. Their mother, Grace, gently reminded him to behave, adjusting his little tie. As they entered through the heavy glass doors, the smell of delicious food filled their nostrils. The host's stand was made of dark wood, matching the restaurant's expensive decor. Behind it stood a tall man in a black suit, looking down at his tablet with intense concentration. Other families were waiting in the lobby, but David noticed something odd. Parties who came in after them were being seated quickly while they continued to wait. At first, they thought nothing of it. Grace commented on the beautiful crystal chandelier above them, trying to keep Tommy entertained as he grew restless. Emily, however, was more observant. She noticed the way the host's eyes would skip over them whenever he looked up to call the next party. She saw how he seemed to find any excuse to avoid making eye contact with her father when he politely asked about their reservation. The minutes ticked by slowly. 15 minutes turned into 20, then 30. They watched as a young couple who had just walked in was immediately shown to a table. David approached the host's stand again, his voice remaining calm and professional despite his growing concern. "Excuse me, we've been waiting for quite a while. We have a reservation under Kim for 6:30. The host barely looked up from his tablet. "We're very busy tonight," he said dismissively. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable at the Chinese restaurant down the street?" His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, their true meaning clear to everyone who heard them. Emily felt her chest tighten as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about being busy at all. What nobody noticed was the elderly woman sitting at a nearby table who had been watching the entire scene unfold. Mrs. Anderson had been coming to this restaurant every Friday night for the past 30 years, and something about the way she set down her wine glass suggested that this quiet evening was about to take an unexpected turn. Little did anyone know that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just the Kim family's evening, but the entire community's perspective on acceptance and equality. Mrs. Anderson's hands trembled slightly as she pushed back her chair, but there was nothing uncertain about the look in her eyes. Her husband Robert reached for her arm, knowing that determined expression all too well. "Martha, don't get yourself worked up," he whispered, but she was already standing. What happened next surprised everyone, especially the host. Instead of confronting him directly, Mrs. Anderson walked over to her longtime friend, Judge William Pierce, who was dining at another table. The restaurant fell unusually quiet as she bent down and whispered something in his ear. The judge's face darkened as he looked over at the Kim family, then back at the host. But before either of them could act, another unexpected figure emerged from the kitchen. Sarah Chen, the restaurant's head chef and secret part owner, who had been alerted by one of her observant waitstaff. The situation became even more complex when David Kim suddenly recognized Judge Pierce. 3 months ago, David, a skilled defense attorney, had argued a case in the judge's courtroom and won, defending a local business against discrimination charges. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone who knew this detail. Meanwhile, Tommy had wandered away from his family during the tension and found himself near the kitchen doors. There, he struck up an innocent conversation with an elderly dishwasher named Mr. Patel, who turned out to be the father of the restaurant's absent owner, Raj Patel. Mr. Patel's eyes filled with tears as he watched the scene unfold in the dining room, remembering his own similar experiences from 40 years ago when he first arrived in the country. Grace noticed her son's absence and turned to look for him, only to find herself face to face with another unexpected dinner guest, her former college professor, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, who had taught a groundbreaking course on civil rights and was now a prominent community leader. Dr. Rodriguez had been quietly observing everything while dining alone in a corner booth. The host, still unaware of the growing web of connections forming around him, made another critical mistake. He loudly announced that the next table was ready for the Thompson party of 4, who had arrived a full hour after the Kims. This time, however, the Thompsons themselves were taken aback. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion, as she revealed that she was the principal at Emily's school and had just the morning awarded her student the prestigious academic achievement they were here to celebrate. As these connections began to surface one by one, Sarah Chen emerged fully from the kitchen, still wearing her chef's coat. Her presence caught everyone off guard, especially the host, whose face turned pale. But before she could speak, the restaurant's front door chimed again. In walked Raj Patel himself, returning early from his business trip abroad, completely unaware of the powder keg he was walking into. His father, Mr. Patel, still standing near Tommy by the kitchen doors, straightened up with pride and worry. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. 7 different parties, all connected in ways nobody could have predicted, stood frozen in this elegant dining room. Emily, watching it all unfold, pulled out her phone and began recording, a decision that would soon prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. But what nobody knew yet was that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would reshape not just this restaurant, but the entire community's understanding of acceptance, justice, and the power of unexpected connections. The silence that filled the restaurant was broken by the sound of Raj Patel's shoes on the marble floor as he walked toward the host stand. But before he could reach it, another dramatic scene began to unfold. A local news reporter, Jennifer Martinez, who had been quietly enjoying her dinner at the bar, had also been recording the entire incident on her phone. She wasn't just any reporter. She was doing a month-long investigation into discrimination in high-end establishments, and this situation had fallen right into her lap. The host, now sweating visibly, tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Patel, I can explain," he started, but his voice trailed off as he noticed Mr. Patel's father walking up behind his son, still standing protectively near young Tommy. The elderly dishwasher's eyes were filled with decades of similar memories, each one etched deeply into his weathered face. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Grace Kim, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, suddenly recognized Sarah Chen, the head chef. 20 years ago, when Grace had first arrived in the country, Sarah had given her her first job as a kitchen helper in a small downtown cafe. That cafe had closed years ago, but Sarah had never forgotten Grace's determination and quick learning ability. Now, standing in her successful restaurant's kitchen, Sarah felt a wave of emotion seeing her former protege being treated this way. The situation took another turn when Mrs. Thompson, the school principal, pulled out a folder from her handbag. It contained Emily's award-winning essay about her family's journey and contributions to their community. She had planned to share it privately with the Kims during dinner, but now she felt compelled to read it aloud. As she began reading, Emily's words filled the restaurant, describing how her grandfather had started as a dishwasher, just like Mr. Patel, and eventually opened a small business that employed dozens of local residents. Judge Pierce, listening intently, suddenly remembered another detail. The case David Kim had won in his courtroom wasn't just any discrimination case. It was against this very restaurant's previous owner, who had sold the place to Raj Patel 6 months ago. The host, as it turned out, was a holdover from that previous management. Meanwhile, Dr. Rodriguez had pulled up an article on her phone that made everyone gasp. The host's photo was there, showing him being fired from another prestigious restaurant across town for similar discriminatory practices. He had hidden this history when applying for his current position. Jennifer Martinez, the reporter, quickly added this new information to her growing story. As these revelations piled up, Tommy innocently asked Mr. Patel why grown-ups made things so complicated. The old man's answer, spoken softly but heard by everyone in the now silent restaurant, would later become the title of Jennifer's award-winning article. "Sometimes, little one, it takes a whole community to serve a single meal of justice." The evening was far from over, and as Raj Patel finally reached the host stand, he carried with him not just his authority as owner, but the weight of his own family's struggles and triumphs. What he was about to say would set in motion an even more unexpected chain of events, ones that would reach far beyond the walls of the Golden Palace restaurant. Unknown to everyone present, this night would become a turning point in their city's history, but not for the reasons any of them could have predicted. Raj Patel stood before his host, his expression unreadable, but before he could speak, the doors burst open again. This time, it was Stanley Chen, Sarah's husband, and a prominent civil rights attorney who had rushed over after receiving a concerned text from his wife. As if the evening hadn't produced enough surprises, Stanley immediately recognized David Kim. They had been opposing counsel in several cases, but had always respected each other's dedication to justice. The host, sensing his position becoming increasingly precarious, made one last desperate attempt to save himself. He pulled out his phone and showed everyone an email, apparently from Raj Patel himself, instructing staff to maintain the restaurant's prestigious atmosphere. But Sarah Chen, still in her chef's coat, quickly noticed something odd about the email's date. It was supposedly sent while Raj was abroad, at exactly the time he had been on a 15-hour flight with no internet access. Meanwhile, Jennifer Martinez was doing some quick research on her phone. The host's social media history revealed connections to several anti-immigrant groups, carefully hidden under fake names. But more surprisingly, she discovered he was the nephew of the restaurant's previous owner, the same one who had lost the discrimination case to David Kim in Judge Pierce's courtroom. Tommy, still standing near Mr. Patel, suddenly remembered something important. Earlier that week, he had visited the restaurant with his school class for a cultural food demonstration. The host had been different then, a kind woman named Maria who had let all the kids peek into the kitchen. When he mentioned this, Dr. Rodriguez's eyes widened. Maria was her daughter, who had called in sick that morning after the host had allegedly told her she was being demoted to kitchen duty. The pieces were starting to fit together, but in a way no one had expected. Emily, still recording on her phone, captured the moment when Mrs. Anderson slowly walked over to the host stand and placed an old yellowed photograph on the counter. The photo showed a much younger Martha Anderson, standing alongside Mr. Patel's late wife in front of a small cafe, the very same one where Sarah Chen had once employed Grace Kim. The restaurant had fallen completely silent as Mrs. Anderson began to speak. She revealed that 30 years ago, when she was a young widow struggling to raise her children, Mrs. Patel had given her a job at that cafe, despite the community's prejudices against hiring single mothers at the time. That act of kindness had changed her life, leading her to meet her current husband, Robert Anderson, who had been a regular customer. But the most shocking revelation came from Judge Pierce. He had been quietly making some calls and discovered that the restaurant's previous owner had never actually sold the place to Raj Patel. The sale had been orchestrated through a shell company, and the real owner was still pulling strings behind the scenes. The host wasn't just discriminating against customers. He was part of a larger scheme to sabotage Raj's ownership and force him to sell the restaurant back at a loss. As these revelations echoed through the elegant dining room, security cameras silently recorded everything. What no one knew yet was that these recordings would soon become key evidence in a case that would shake the city's restaurant industry to its core. But for now, all eyes were on Raj Patel as he absorbed these startling discoveries about his own business. The decision he would make next would not only change the lives of everyone present, but would also set a precedent that would ripple through the community for years to come. Just as Raj Patel opened his mouth to respond to these revelations, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. The previous owner, James Whitaker, was currently in the restaurant's private wine cellar, apparently destroying evidence of the fraudulent sale. Security cameras had caught him entering through a hidden back entrance that even Raj didn't know existed. But Whitaker wasn't alone. Maria, the kind host who Tommy remembered, was down there too. She hadn't actually called in sick. She had been gathering evidence of the discrimination scheme for weeks, secretly working with Jennifer Martinez on her investigation. However, Whitaker had discovered her undercover work, and now both she and the evidence were in danger. Dr. Rodriguez, hearing that her daughter was in potential danger, started toward the cellar stairs, but Stanley Chen, the civil rights attorney, gently held her back. "We need to handle this legally," he whispered, already dialing 911 on his phone. However, Grace Kim, drawing on skills from her previous career as a security consultant, a detail she had never mentioned to anyone at her daughter's school, had a different plan. Meanwhile, Emily's phone recording had automatically uploaded to her cloud storage and was now going viral on social media. The hashtag #WashGoldenPalaceJustice was trending locally, and a small crowd had begun gathering outside the restaurant. Among them was Lisa Chen, Sarah and Stanley's daughter, who worked as a cybersecurity expert. She had received her mother's text and was already hacking into the restaurant's security system to prevent Whitaker from deleting any footage. Tommy, still by Mr. Patel's side, suddenly remembered something crucial. During the school visit earlier that week, he had dropped his toy car in the wine cellar while exploring. When he and Maria went to retrieve it, he had noticed a strange laptop hidden behind some wine boxes. Maria had quickly ushered him out, but not before he saw what looked like property documents on the screen. Sarah Chen, master of her kitchen's layout, knew of a hidden service elevator that led to the cellar, a remnant from the building's Prohibition era. As the adults debated what to do, she quietly slipped away, taking the old service route down. What she didn't know was that Grace Kim had noticed and followed her, leaving David to keep everyone calm upstairs. Judge Pierce, recognizing the legal implications unfolding, began documenting everything on his phone's voice recorder. Mrs. Anderson, however, was going through her own old photos on her phone, finding something that made her gasp. A picture from a charity event 20 years ago, showing Whitaker shaking hands with a younger Mr. Patel. The date on the photo matched exactly with the day Mr. Patel's wife had mysteriously lost her share in their original family restaurant. Jennifer Martinez's investigation was taking an even darker turn. Her quick research revealed that similar schemes had played out at 3 other Asian-owned restaurants in different cities, all with the same pattern: discriminatory practices driving away customers, followed by distressed sales to shell companies. The host's connection to Whitaker wasn't just about one restaurant. It was part of a larger, organized effort to systematically push out Asian restaurant owners. As police sirens wailed in the distance, responding to Stanley's call, no one noticed Tommy slipping away from Mr. Patel. The boy had remembered something else about his lost toy car. It had his father's spare micro SD card stuck inside it, the one David used to secretly record all his legal meetings. The car was still somewhere in that wine cellar, possibly near that hidden laptop, potentially holding audio recordings from when David had met with Whitaker's previous clients. The situation was escalating rapidly on multiple fronts, but the biggest shock was still to come. Security footage from the cellar, now streaming to Lisa Chen's laptop outside, showed that Maria wasn't just gathering evidence about discrimination. She had uncovered something much bigger, something that would expose corruption at the highest levels of the city's business community. And now, Grace and Sarah were unknowingly walking into a confrontation that would change far more than just one restaurant's future. The old service elevator creaked softly as Sarah and Grace descended into the dimly lit wine cellar. The air grew cooler with each passing second, but their racing hearts barely noticed the temperature change. Through the gaps in the wine racks, they could see flashlight beams dancing across the walls. Whitaker and Maria were somewhere in the maze-like cellar. Upstairs, Emily's viral video had caught the attention of someone unexpected, her online friend Sophia, who happened to be Whitaker's estranged daughter. Sophia immediately recognized her father's scheme. It was the same pattern that had torn their family apart years ago when she had tried to expose his previous discriminatory business practices. She was already in an Uber, racing toward the Golden Palace with a USB drive containing years of damaging evidence against her father. Meanwhile, Tommy had discovered a small ventilation shaft behind a wine rack, just big enough for a child to crawl through. Without telling anyone, he squeezed inside, following the sounds of voices. His missing toy car had become much more important than anyone realized. The SD card stuck inside contained not only David's legal meetings, but had accidentally recorded a conversation between Whitaker and several city officials 6 months ago when David had left his jacket in a council meeting room. Mr. Patel, noticing Tommy's absence, frantically scanned the restaurant. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the small ventilation grate slightly ajar. Memories flooded back. During Prohibition, these shafts had been used to smuggle messages between the cellar and the street. He immediately got hold of Lisa Chen outside, who used her phone to access the building's original blueprints. The ventilation system led not just to the cellar, but to an old underground tunnel network connecting several buildings in the area. In the cellar, Maria had managed to send a series of coded food orders to the kitchen, something only another restaurant worker would understand. Robert Anderson, who had worked as a chef in his younger days, decoded the message: second passage, hidden room, files and wall safe, code 05-872. The date struck Mrs. Anderson immediately. It was the day Mr. Patel's wife had passed away. David Kim, still upstairs, suddenly remembered something from the discrimination case he had won. The previous owner had been unusually insistent about keeping certain financial records sealed. He quickly called his office where his assistant was working late. The sealed documents might hold the key to proving the shell company's scheme. Judge Pierce received an urgent email from a colleague on the federal bench. Similar cases of discriminatory restaurant takeovers were being investigated in 5 other states. The Golden Palace wasn't just one incident. It was the potential key to exposing a nationwide operation targeting Asian-owned businesses. Down in the cellar, Grace and Sarah froze as they heard Tommy's voice. He was talking to someone through the ventilation shaft. To their horror, they realized he was directly above Whitaker's location. But before they could move, they heard another voice that made their blood run cold. Through the shaft came the unmistakable sound of Whitaker on a phone call, revealing that Tommy's toy car wasn't just in the cellar. It had been found, and someone was already extracting the SD card. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Lisa Chen's hacking had revealed something extraordinary. The restaurant's security cameras were part of a larger network, feeding into a server that collected data from dozens of other establishments. The discrimination wasn't just about denying service. It was about gathering personal information on successful Asian business owners for some larger, more sinister purpose. As police lights flashed outside and Sophia's Uber pulled up to the curb, no one realized that the real purpose of Whitaker's wine cellar meeting was about to be revealed. The evidence being destroyed wasn't just about the Golden Palace. It was about something much bigger, something that would shake the foundations of the city's power structure. And Tommy, crawling through the narrow shaft, was about to stumble upon a truth that would put everyone in far more danger than they could imagine. The next few moments unfolded like scenes from a complex thriller. Through the ventilation shaft, Tommy had emerged into a hidden room behind the wine cellar's far wall. His small flashlight beam revealed something unexpected. Dozens of screens showing live feeds from restaurants across the city. But what caught his attention was a familiar face on one of the monitors. His mother, Grace, in security footage from 5 years ago. She wasn't just a former security consultant. She had been investigating restaurant discrimination cases long before this night. Sophia burst through the restaurant's front doors, clutching her USB drive, only to come face to face with her father's most trusted associate, her own mother, Catherine Whitaker, who had been quietly dining in a dark corner all evening. Catherine had been secretly feeding information to Grace Kim for years, trying to protect her daughter while gathering evidence against her husband's operation. In the cellar, Maria had managed to send one final coded message before Whitaker discovered her. Red Dragon Rising. Sarah Chen's face went pale. It was an emergency protocol she and other Asian restaurant owners had established years ago. Within minutes, restaurant owners across the city began backing up their security footage and financial records, protecting themselves from whatever was coming. Judge Pierce received a cryptic text from the federal investigation team. Operation Golden Dragon compromised. Protect the Kims. It turned out David Kim's victory in the discrimination case hadn't been just about justice. It had been part of a larger federal investigation into money laundering through restaurant acquisitions. The discriminatory practices were just a cover for something much more sinister. Lisa Chen's hacking had revealed another layer of the scheme. The security cameras weren't just gathering data. They were using facial recognition to track specific individuals, prominent Asian business owners, their families, and, most disturbingly, their children. Emily's viral video had accidentally exposed this surveillance network to the public. Mr. Patel, hearing familiar footsteps above the ventilation shaft, realized something that made his heart race. The building's blueprints showed another room, parallel to the hidden surveillance center. In that room, 30 years ago, he and his wife had hidden documents proving that several prominent city officials had been involved in forcing Asian business owners out of their properties. His wife had died protecting these secrets, and now both Tommy and Maria were trapped near that very room. Grace and Sarah, following the sound of Tommy's voice, discovered a shocking truth. The wine cellar's walls contained hidden servers, the heart of an operation that went beyond restaurants. Bank records, property deeds, and blackmail material filled the digital storage. They weren't just fighting discrimination. They had stumbled upon a decades-old system of organized corruption. Upstairs, Dr. Rodriguez was putting the pieces together, the forced sales, the discrimination, the surveillance. It was all connected to a massive urban development plan that would demolish the entire historic district, erasing decades of immigrant business history. The Golden Palace was just the first domino meant to fall. As police surrounded the building, Stanley Chen received an urgent call from his contact at the FBI. The corruption wasn't limited to their city. Similar surveillance systems had been discovered in Asian business districts across the country. The Golden Palace had become ground zero for exposing a national conspiracy. But the most startling revelation came from Tommy himself. Through the ventilation shaft, he had found not just the surveillance room, but a hidden safe. Inside was a single photograph that would change everything. A young James Whittaker shaking hands with Mr. Patel's wife. But in the background was a face everyone would recognize. The current mayor, accepting an envelope 3 decades ago. The same mayor who was now rushing toward the restaurant with a private security team, claiming to be there to resolve the situation. The truth was about to explode into the open, but time was running out. Maria's last message had been cut short. Tommy was still in the hidden room, and Grace and Sarah were now trapped between Whittaker and his approaching security team. The mayor's arrival wasn't about protecting anyone. It was about making sure certain secrets stayed buried in that cellar forever. The next 5 minutes changed everything. As the mayor's security team approached the restaurant, Jennifer Martinez made a split-second decision that would prove historic. She began live streaming everything to her news channel's website. The feed quickly picked up over 100,000 viewers, turning the Golden Palace into the most watched location in the country. In the hidden room, Tommy had accidentally kicked his toy car against a wall panel, revealing something extraordinary. A stack of old ledgers in Mrs. Patel's handwriting. Each page documented meetings between city officials and what she called the Property Acquisition Group. But it was the last entry, dated the day of her death, that made Tommy's hands shake. "They think these are all the records," she had written. "The real evidence is where only my son will think to look." Raj Patel, hearing these words read aloud through Tommy's open phone line, suddenly understood. Every Sunday, his mother had taken him to the restaurant's kitchen and taught him to make her special biryani. The recipe box was still there, 30 years later, untouched on the highest shelf. Inside, mixed with the recipe cards, were microfilm records of every corrupt deal the city had ever made with the Property Acquisition Group. The mayor, watching the growing crowd outside on his car's television, made a crucial mistake. He called Catherine Whittaker, not knowing she had turned against her husband's scheme. The call was recorded by the FBI agents who had been monitoring her phone for months. His words were damning. "Make sure nothing leaves that cellar. Use whatever force necessary." But the mayor hadn't counted on Grace Kim's past. During her security consultant days, she had helped design panic rooms for high-profile clients, including one in the Golden Palace's cellar. As Whittaker's men closed in, she led Sarah and Maria toward a wine rack that concealed a hidden door. The panic room had its own ventilation system, connecting to the very shaft Tommy had used. Outside, Sophia Whittaker was going through her USB drive with Lisa Chen, uncovering something unexpected. The restaurant surveillance system wasn't just watching people, it was gathering data for an AI program designed to predict which businesses would be most vulnerable to takeover attempts. The discrimination was being automated, targeting establishments using algorithms based on decades of successful forced sales. Judge Pierce, still upstairs, received another federal alert. Similar systems had been found in 15 other cities, all connected to the same development company. A company that had just been awarded contracts for urban renewal projects worth billions. The Golden Palace wasn't just one restaurant story. It was the key to exposing America's largest organized discrimination scheme. Mr. Patel had made his way to the kitchen, climbing shakily onto a chair to reach his wife's recipe box. But when he opened it, he found something else too. A letter addressed to Raj, explaining why she had kept such detailed records. She had known what would happen, had prepared for this very day. The letter ended with a code, the same numbers as her biryani recipe, but meant for something else entirely. In the cellar panic room, Grace remembered something from her security days. These rooms usually had emergency power supplies, separate from the building's main system. One button could shut down the entire restaurant's power, including the servers holding decades of surveillance data, but using it would also trap everyone in the darkened cellar. Tommy, still in the surveillance room, watched as his father David suddenly stood up in the main dining room. Through the camera feed, he saw him walk to the center of the restaurant and begin speaking. Not to the diners or the police, but directly to the security cameras. "I know you're watching," he said. "All of you, in every city, in every restaurant like this one. Tonight, it ends." The mayor had reached the restaurant's front door, flanked by his security team. But he faced an unexpected sight. Hundreds of people, phones raised, streaming everything live. Among them were faces he recognized, restaurant owners from across the city, many holding their own records, their own evidence. Emily's viral video hadn't just exposed one incident. It had given courage to hundreds of others to come forward. But in the cellar, time was running out. Whitaker had found the entrance to the panic room. The mayor was moments away from entering the restaurant. And Tommy had just discovered something on the surveillance screens that changed everything. Live footage from other restaurants showing similar hidden rooms, similar servers, and similar evidence being destroyed at that very moment. The conspiracy was trying to erase itself, and the Golden Palace was the last place where the truth still survived. What happened next became known as the Golden Palace moment. Grace Kim, her finger hovering over the emergency power button, heard a familiar tune coming through the ventilation system. Tommy was humming the lullaby she used to sing him as a baby. But it wasn't random. In her security days, she had taught him musical codes, and this one meant, wait 3 minutes. Upstairs, Catherine Whitaker made her move. As the mayor stepped into the restaurant, she stood up and began playing a video on the dining room's large screen. Footage from 30 years ago showing a young Mrs. Patel leaving a safety deposit box at the city's oldest bank. The box number matched the secret code in her recipe card, 275349. Mr. Patel, still in the kitchen, dropped the recipe box in shock. Those numbers weren't just a code, they were also the dimensions of the original Golden Palace building plans. Lisa Chen, working frantically on her laptop outside, discovered something crucial. The restaurant servers weren't just connected to other restaurants. They were backing up data to a hidden location. Following the digital trail, she realized why Tommy had said to wait 3 minutes. At exactly 9:45 p.m., the system would perform its daily backup. If they timed it right, they could capture everything. But Whitaker had his own plans. Through the surveillance room screens, Tommy watched in horror as men in maintenance uniforms entered restaurants across the city, heading for their hidden servers. This wasn't just about destroying evidence anymore. It was about erasing decades of history in one coordinated strike. Sarah Chen, trapped in the panic room with Grace and Maria, remembered something about the building's history. During Prohibition, the restaurant had a water drainage system that connected to the city's old tunnel network. The tunnels had been sealed, but the maps in Maria's evidence showed they might still be accessible through the cellar floor. Judge Pierce received one final message from his federal contacts. Operation Golden Dragon activated. Across the city, FBI agents who had been posing as restaurant staff for months made their moves. But they weren't just after Whitaker and the mayor. They were after someone much bigger, someone whose identity was hidden in the data being backed up at 9:45. Emily, her phone still recording, captured the moment her father David faced the mayor. "You know what's interesting about discrimination?" he said calmly. "It leaves a trail. Every denied reservation, every forced sale, every coincidental health inspection. It all adds up, and tonight, that trail leads right here." The mayor laughed, but his confidence was shattered by a sound from above. Police helicopters were circling the building, their searchlights illuminating the growing crowd. News vans had arrived, their satellite dishes broadcasting everything live. The hashtag #Golden Palace Justice had gone international, with millions watching worldwide. In the surveillance room, Tommy found what everyone had been looking for: a master list of every property taken, every owner forced out, every life changed by the scheme. But more importantly, he found the name at the top of the organization chart. It wasn't the mayor or even any of the known players. It was someone whose identity would shake the very foundation of the city's power structure. As 9:45 approached, Grace understood what had to happen. The power couldn't go out before the backup, but once it started, they would have exactly 30 seconds to transfer the data before Whitaker's team could stop it. They needed a distraction, something big enough to keep everyone occupied for those crucial seconds. That's when they heard it, the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen. Mr. Patel had found more than just recipes in his wife's box. He found a key, and that key fit a lock that hadn't been opened in 3 decades. Behind that door lay the final piece of evidence, something so damaging that his wife had given her life to protect it. As 9:45 struck on the restaurant's antique clock, the truth was about to come out in a way that no one, not even the mysterious figure at the top of the organization chart, could have predicted. At exactly 9:45 p.m., multiple events exploded simultaneously across the Golden Palace. Mr. Patel's key had opened more than just a door. It revealed a hidden safe containing an old VHS tape. The label, in Mrs. Patel's handwriting, read, "Insurance Policy, 1992. The same year, the Property Acquisition Group had begun its operations, and the same year, the city's current governor had been a young real estate lawyer. As the backup system hummed to life, Tommy made a discovery that changed everything. The surveillance screens showed split-second glitches, timestamps that didn't match. Whitaker hadn't just been gathering data. He'd been editing history, erasing evidence of meetings, changing dates of property sales. But the original data still existed, hidden in fragments across hundreds of restaurant servers. Lisa Chen's laptop suddenly lit up with incoming data. The backup wasn't just copying files, it was reconstructing them, putting the fragments back together like a digital puzzle. Names, dates, and transactions began flowing across her screen. Among them was a familiar name, Catherine Whitaker, but not as a conspirator, as the original whistleblower. She had been working undercover for the FBI for decades, gathering evidence while pretending to support her husband's schemes. In the panic room, Grace heard footsteps above. Someone was walking across the exact spot her old security designs had marked as structurally vulnerable. She remembered installing a manual release lever that would drop that section of flooring into the cellar. One pull would bring whoever was up there crashing down, but they'd have no way of knowing who it was. Emily's livestream captured the moment the mayor realized he'd lost control. The VHS tape from Mr. Patel's safe was being played on every screen in the restaurant, showing a young governor accepting bribes, planning forced buyouts, and orchestrating the very discrimination system they had used for decades. But something about the footage seemed off to David Kim's trained eye. There were 2 identical tapes playing simultaneously. Judge Pierce understood first. Mrs. Patel hadn't just made one copy. She'd hidden identical tapes in every restaurant involved in the scheme, each one timed to play at exactly 9:45 p.m. if the building's power systems were ever compromised. It wasn't just evidence. It was a dead woman's farewell message to the corrupt empire that had tried to destroy her community. The backup completed at 9:44:58 p.m. Grace pulled the emergency power switch at 9:44:59 p.m., and at exactly 9:45 p.m., as darkness fell over the Golden Palace, hundreds of screens across the city lit up with Mrs. Patel's face. Her final testimony, recorded the day before her death, exposed not just the discrimination scheme, but a decades-long conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of state government. The lever Grace had pulled brought down more than just flooring. It dropped James Whitaker right into the middle of the panic room, surrounded by the very evidence he'd tried to destroy. But he wasn't looking at the files or the servers. He was staring at an old photograph that had fallen from his pocket, showing him and Mrs. Patel not as enemies, but as young business partners, before greed had corrupted him, before the Property Acquisition Group had turned neighbor against neighbor. Tommy, finding his way back through the ventilation shaft, emerged into a transformed restaurant. FBI agents were leading away the mayor in handcuffs. Catherine Whitaker was hugging her daughter Sophia, years of forced separation finally over. And Mr. Patel stood in his kitchen, tears streaming down his face, as his wife's voice filled the room, her final words bringing justice to their community. 1 year later, the Golden Palace celebrated its anniversary as a symbol of change. The restaurant had become a gathering place for the community, its walls now decorated with photographs of every family that had fought back against discrimination. Emily's viral video had sparked a national movement, leading to new laws protecting immigrant businesses. Tommy's toy car sat in a glass case by the entrance, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things could expose the biggest truths. Grace and David Kim hosted monthly community dinners where people from all backgrounds shared their stories. Sarah Chen's kitchen became a training ground for aspiring chefs from marginalized communities. And Mr. Patel, though retired, still came in every Sunday to make his wife's biryani, sharing not just the recipe, but the story of how love, courage, and an old recipe box had brought down an empire of hatred. The Golden Palace had transformed from a symbol of discrimination into a beacon of hope, and somewhere, Mrs. Patel was smiling, knowing that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that sometimes the longest wait for a table could lead to the most important meal of all.